Good morning, everyone. I'm Lindsay Polloway, Executive Director at Atlantic Live, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Higher Education at a Crossroads in Atlantic Next America Forum. President Trump has called education the civil rights issue of our time and said to a joint session of Congress last month, "We must enrich the mind and souls of every American child." What exactly will be on the president's agenda for higher ed is not yet clear. What is clear is that there are considerable challenges in the higher ed world. We'll be talking about those this morning. Who can afford to go to school? Who ends up graduating? And how do students make sure the time they spend in school is really worth it? Among the people we'll hear from today, community college presidents, university presidents, and local and national policymakers. And we'll ask them what they think the priorities for higher ed should be in this new administration. Before we begin the conversation, I want to thank the Lumina Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for making our morning together possible. On that note, it gives me real pleasure to invite Daniel Greenstein, Director of Postsecondary Success at the Gates Foundation, to say a few words. Dan?
Thank you. Good morning. So it's a privilege to be able to join you today and to share just a few thoughts. Special thanks to our partners at The Atlantic for all of their efforts to raise awareness of these critical issues. Thanks to good friend and colleague, Jamie Marasotis, and his team at Lumina. We're proud to partner with Lumina on this and actually many other initiatives. So the discussions we're going to have today, they're timely and they're urgent. Our nation faces an opportunity gap, and it's at a critical point in its history. That gap represents a disconnect between the promise and the reality of the American dream. A sense among many of our fellow citizens that they have been let down by our economic and social institutions. That sense is driving anxiety and discontentment that is showing up in our politics and our public discourse today, and likely ongoing. This sense of disappointment is targeted as much at higher education as it is at other of our nation's civic institutions. Nearly all of the new post-recession jobs require education after high school, but too many people don't have access to that education. Today, a high-income student is 7 times more likely to have a degree by the age of 24 than a low-income student, 7 times more likely. And college attainment gaps by race and ethnicity haven't budged in decades. And in some cases, they're widening, and both of these trends contribute directly to growing inequality in this country. The reality behind these numbers, it's simple and it's stark. Our prevailing model of higher education in this country, it's just not sustainable. It prizes exclusion at a time when competitiveness is all about inclusion. It's resistant to measures of institutional effectiveness and efficiency in an era of tightening resources and growing and very reasonable questions about value. I read where 90% of college and university presidents recently surveyed believe that Americans just don't understand the purpose of higher education. And I think that's just an unfortunate and consequential misreading of public knowledge and public sentiment. Our enterprise faces a need for fundamental change, like virtually every knowledge-based enterprise has faced in the past generation. Think of healthcare. Think of financial services. Our friends at The Atlantic will tell you about journalism. So change of this magnitude, it demands that we question fundamental assumptions about our students and what works for them, that we challenge conventional wisdom about the pace of change, and that we push back on individual and institutional inertia. It means being accountable to our constituents, our students, their employers, our local, state, and federal funders. It means being accountable for the tangible value that we add in higher education, like Paul Quinn and National Louis universities have done. It means using data to design stronger and clearer pathways to a credential for all our students, like Delaware State University has done. It means taking students who have the drive but not the grades to succeed and working intensively with them as they're doing at Johnson C. Smith University. And it means redefining prestige, not in terms of the students that we exclude, but in terms of the students we include and how well they do, as at Georgia State University and Florida International. So after nearly 5 years leading the Foundation's post-secondary success work, I've come to the conclusion that the central challenge in helping more Americans realize their educational dreams, it's not one of skill. We have a great deal of knowledge about what works for today's students, and we're learning more every day. Rather, I see two fundamental obstacles to our progress. One is access to that knowledge of what works. It's not consistently available to campuses and system leaders, especially those at the less well-resourced institutions. And in an era of open educational resources and the internet, that doesn't make any sense to me. It's inexcusable. And the second and perhaps larger hurdle to clear, I think, is the will to change. Even where there is movement towards new ways of serving our students, those efforts can be stranded in the land of the one-off pilot project because some of the fundamental rules of the game, including and maybe especially funding streams, accountability measures, faculty prerogative about how we teach and who we teach, can reinforce old ways of doing things. So that's why our foundation is building a coalition of the willing, forming partnerships with campuses, with systems that are taking steps to transform themselves in the interest of their students, in the interest of their students' success and of equitable education attainment. And it's also why we're partnering, and our partners are engaging with state and federal policymakers on issues like simplifying federal aid for low-income students and improving data and information about student outcomes. Progress is slow, change is hard, but it's discernible. And every day it seems like there are new points of light illuminating what we can and must accomplish to bridge opportunity gaps in this country. So coming away from today's sessions, I challenge each of you to identify one assumption or piece of conventional wisdom about higher education, if you're at a college or a university, at your institution, that should be questioned, or at least investigated further, just one, because it matters. It matters to the person who is first in their family to attempt college. It matters to the working adult. It matters to the student parent. And ultimately, it matters to all of us. So let's get to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. A few practical notes before we get started. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. We'd love if you could tweet along with us. We're at Atlantic Live, and use the hashtag #NextAmerica. And we want you to be a part of the conversation in the room as well. We'll have time for your questions, so please get them ready. Now let's get the conversation rolling. Our first guest is someone who will play a meaningful role on the Hill, defining the higher ed agenda. Congresswoman Susan Davis is a Democrat from California. She's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development. And here to lead the conversation is Atlantic Live contributor Joey Chen. Joey, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay and Dan. We appreciate this. Congresswoman, we've just come from, just yesterday was your first day as the new ranking member of the Subcommittee on Higher Education. As Dan's referred to, I think there's an opportunity for us to just take one 30,000-foot view here on what you think the priorities are going into this new administration.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. I'm glad everyone is joining us. One of the first things that I think we need to think about a little differently maybe is how we redefine higher education. We know that many people enter certificate programs, other adult education, and we certainly have had such a robust community college experience for many students today. And I think thinking about what it means, it's all education after high school, as I think people have mentioned. And that might make a difference for young people as well when they're thinking about, is this a possibility for me? Where am I going to go and what's my future going to look like? The other issues, of course, have to do with how we fund, what the federal government is going to do today and tomorrow and certainly in this administration to give confidence to people that they're going to be there. They're going to be there in the ways that they have been before. So protecting what we have and also building on that is going to be part of our agenda.
Well, I'm sure that is going to be a big part of the questions on the minds of the folks in our audience. I want to encourage you to think about whatever questions you have, because in a few minutes we're going to take some of your questions as well. But I am struck, of course, we have had in this forum a couple conversations already about the higher education authorization and the never-ending continuances of that reauthorization, it seems. What's going to happen now, in your
Well,
view?
at the core of it, really, I think for all young people, of course, is affordability. You know, we talk about access, but the reality is if you can't afford it, it's not accessible to you. So we need to be sure that young people know that there are ways that they're going to get assistance. And part of that may be, as we look at the higher education reauthorization, is making sure that early on in a young person's education, they have a sense of whether, where they're going to fit into this and what kind of aid, what kind of assistance is available to them. In our discussion yesterday, I think it was clear that we have to make it easier, simpler, and yet maintain many of the programs that are there today. There was a lot of talk about simplification, but I worry about that because when people start simplifying, they're cutting and they're not necessarily adding. And I think we want to look at value added. I mean, that's where we are right now. So making it more affordable and having a system. We have the FAFSA, we have the way in which young people and their families fill out these forms. They've gotten a little bit easier.
That has been actually a point of discussion as one of the many incarnations of the reauthorization have been discussed, the idea of reducing the FAFSA to something more like a 1040EZ, that it'd be a couple questions.
Right. And the reality is that, families have this information. And so it may be that we need to start students much earlier, even in middle school, as thinking about what is a FAFSA, so they know what that is, so their families know what that is, and finding a better way to access that. We also know, and we had in the discussion yesterday, that there are families, they have to keep re-verifying that information. And that maybe is really something that is not necessary.
So to that point, the SEOG, the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, this is something that people have come to rely on. A lot of early entry people, families trying to bring their first student into the higher education experience. What's going to happen here?
Well, I think that's the scary part, I think, for us, because we're hearing discussions of, we can get rid of this program or that program. And the reality is they all serve a purpose. And we have to be sure that the students behind that purpose are still getting the kind of assistance that's needed. And there are different ways. Some campus aid is important to students. A lot of these grants, states have different grants, and certainly the university system in California has their own way of making sure that students have the opportunities to engage within the university and outside, even in public service, and at the same time that they're having some help and assistance as they're trying to move through their education. I think the other thing that we really have to face is it's affordability. It's making sure that students are able to get to school, but once they're there, what kind of help do they need? And when students are in school for 6 years rather than 4 years or 5 years, that really makes a difference in terms of the debt that they're going to have when they leave school. And our goal has to be to reduce that.
Are you hearing anything? Obviously, we've seen quite a sea change in many areas of the new administration and the new Secretary of Education. Do you have a specific concern, particularly on the affordability question and financing education?
Well, in the skinny budget that was just released, yes. We do, because the Pell Grants, which many, many students depend on, and we want them to have an opportunity perhaps to extend them through the summer period, which is very important in terms of year-round summer Pell, in terms of making sure that they're not in school if they don't have to be for an extended period of time. Summer's going to help that. And
that refers to what you were talking about earlier, that we may not just be looking at a 4-year college experience where you go September to May or whatever.
Right. Many, many students would like to take advantage of that summertime, but there are no Pell Grants that back them up in that period. And as we know, Pell Grants also have some caps in terms of the number of units. So for those students, we want to be sure that Pell Grant can be extended, and in the budget, they're basically taking that money, which is around $4 billion, and doing away with it, essentially, putting it into something else that might affect students, but on the other hand, might not, certainly not students of low income.
But
and we're going to try and protect that.
Aren't they talking about taking away just something from the surplus on the Pell?
It's from the surplus, but it's the money that would be used, that could certainly be used for that year-round Pell. Without that, it's hard to see where those dollars going to come from. And in this skinny budget, of course, we're seeing that non-discretionary non-defense is going, or discretionary non-defense is going to really suffer under that budget.
But couldn't there be an argument for that sort of simplification? In other words, why do you have a CEOG and a Pell? Why don't you just roll it into one thing? Why does the surplus have to work that way?
Well, as always, I think that the devil's going to be in the details for that, because if that means that there's less of both, even less of one of those opportunities that students have, then we're looking at a scaled down support system. And I think at this particular time, we know, and certainly if the president's saying it's the civil rights issue of our time, then we need to be sure that every young person can aspire to and know what it is that they want to do someday, and that there's going to be an educational program that fits their needs. And if that's not there, then I think young people don't have the kind of hope, because they're smart enough to know, all young people know, that I'm going to do better if I have something beyond high school today.
I think we're probably preaching to the choir on this point, though.
It's necessary, so we have to do that.
All right, so let's talk about some of the other issues that have already come up in the course of this administration. Things have come very rapidly in a lot of arenas, but I think particularly in education, higher education as well. To pivot a little bit, I know you are a Cal Bear yourself, and so you must have watched with great interest the events at Berkeley, particularly in the arena of free speech and what we do with that, and the concerns expressed by the president about federal funding to an institution like Cal.
Yes, right. Well, certainly federal funding is a big concern of the students there, as it was a number of years ago. And the other thing that clearly students are very concerned about is what's going to happen to DACA students, what's going to happen to the immigration
Have you
for
heard
students.
from schools within your district or elsewhere in California just about their concerns for their students on the immigration question?
Absolutely. We just held a forum in San Diego that I convened with a lot of the stakeholders, universities, community colleges, and everybody that's involved really in higher education at that level. And that was one of the key issues that they brought. We had some students that were there as well, and the students spoke very eloquently about the concerns, about the fears that they have. We know that's out there, and we need to be sure that when we're thinking about what the environment for students is like at school, we want to make it a safe one, an inclusive one. And with those concerns and those worries at the universities and colleges, that's a difficult thing.
So can universities, colleges, community colleges, can they be sanctuaries?
Well, it's within a context of a city and a community and a state. And so those are issues that I think they're facing, and they want to be sure that they're doing everything they can to have the kind of support systems there for their students, so that if they need help, if they need assistance, if they are worried, and they want to know, what could happen to me, we want to have people there to talk to them about that.
But from your view, can universities or colleges or administrations retain information, keep that information back where it pertains to their students and their status, their immigration status, when they're accepting federal funding?
Yeah, generally speaking, that university retains that information, but I think that there are concerns about that, and that's really what we have to work out. And at this point, I think it's a matter of being certain that students have the information that they need, to the extent that the universities and colleges have that information as well.
You talked about the students coming forward on that free speech issue. What's do you see an environment? I keep coming back to this notion. You're a Berkeley Bear yourself, so you know what the
and
speech
I happened to be
issue
there during a critical period of time at Berkeley,
a previous critical period of time on campus.
Yes.
This is really the closed world of a university campus has changed just within the past few weeks, and the views from Washington about what ought to be free speech rights, protected rights on campus seem to be changing.
That's true, but I think, again, we're in the middle of that discussion on the universities, and I think that having the appropriate forums there as well is critical, and of course the community plays a vital role in that as well.
Again, I want to encourage people to come forward with their questions as you start to think about some of these issues that we've raised here. Secretary DeVos, in one of her early statements, has talked about this idea that faculties are speaking to students and essentially telling them what to think. Is this a place where legislators can become involved, can put any kind of voice to this?
Well, I think at most universities and certainly our colleges, there is a belief that everybody is welcome to speak, and we certainly want to invite people to our campuses that we don't agree with. That exchange of ideas, no matter how maybe unliked by some, is something that they know is important to their own vision and turn to their own beliefs in a community that really can have that exchange.
So both in the cases of Berkeley and Middlebury,
right,
where you had speakers who raised some hackles within the students and in some sense raised some physical acts, violent acts, on the course of those campuses.
There are red lines, I think, for people in terms of what they see as the credo that someone is going to bring to that campus. And students have a right to protest against that. They should. But again, I think sometimes it's the preparation for those speakers that's critical and that's important in gathering people to talk about it in advance. But, I think we have to expect that there are going to be problems around that, and I think those in power at those schools, those in the appropriate positions, that's what we pay them the big bucks for. They need to be able to deal with that.
Well, the administration has also taken some different positions with respect to, for example, bringing Mr. Falwell on board to guide some new thinking on higher education, college environments. I've done a lot of reporting on sex crimes on campus, and I have some concern about where that goes. Where do you see the nature of the administration, the focus of the administration changing to a point that concerns you?
Well, I have a great deal of concern. Title IX is something that we value greatly on our universities and our campuses. I think when you have somebody who, speaks lightly of the value of that and maybe is, thinks that we could discard it in certain areas, I think that's wrong. I think that we need to rely on our students in many cases to tell their stories on campuses, because universities, colleges, are all part of a larger society. We see that even in the military. And we need to be sure that people understand why it's so important to hold everybody accountable at that university, whether it's professors, students, of course, and the greater community. If you have somebody who's going to be in a position chairing a task force for higher education, which Reverend Falwell Jr. has been asked to do by the president, then that's serious business. And I think that we need to be sure that the rules by which universities and colleges play today is something that is a zero tolerance, and that there is just no acceptance whatsoever for that kind of behavior on campus. We know that young people engage in all kinds of activities and of course, in a learning process. But I think that we have seen that people have been abused on campuses, and that is unacceptable. And so to sort of say to a campus, well, you know, Title IX might apply, might not apply, that can't be. We also need to be sure, and I've authored a bill that provides advocates on campus for young people, whether or not they have found themselves in a bad position of even verbal harassment or also actual sexual exploitation. We need to be sure that there are people there that they can talk to, and they know how to work that system so that they get the help and support, and that those who perhaps need to be brought to justice are.
If we can bring to the microphone any questions in our audience.
Yes, good morning. I'm with AAUW, and we will shortly be releasing a report on student debt, deeper in debt, and the impact it has adversely on women. But obviously, in gathering that data, we noticed that for-profit schools can be problematic. So I'd love to hear what type of legislative approach or lens might be applied to that. And thank you.
There have been a number of bills actually on the subject of for-profit, I would say exploitation in some cases. Not all. We have for-profits, of course, that are quite responsible and provide people with good information, are transparent, but that's not the case always. And we know even for our military, about a third of our, the 9/11 GI Bill dollars, taxpayer dollars, go towards for-profit schools. And part of it is because, again, you've got access, easy access, and sometimes people are looking for an opportunity to move through information in a pretty fast way, and that isn't necessarily offered at all of our schools. So there are reasons why people access these programs, but we need to make sure that they're transparent, that we have the information, that they're part of a data collection that's showing, whether or not students are able to complete school and what happens to them when they leave. If their experience at the school provides no value in terms of what they're able to bring to work, then obviously that time and effort and cost hasn't been well spent. And we see that certainly in terms of our military explicitly and others as well. And we have a number of
federal money
cases that have gone to trial. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. William Gill with American Association Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. Congresswoman, can you please give us, share your thoughts when we will see the HEA reauthorization come up for discussion?
I wish I knew. Yeah, so at this point, I don't think that the majority has a timeline, although we have begun, discussions. And certainly the meeting that we had yesterday that was around funding options for students is a critical one, because I think that's really the core. We've got to be sure that affordability is there for all young people. And others too, because again, higher education is not just after you exit high school, but it's everything beyond high school, and those programs need to be there.
Do you see that whatever the timeline is, do you see that this is going to follow sort of the path that was started? I mean, there was the hope that this would have come up and been through last year and the year before. But, I mean, do you see the format changing significantly?
I actually think there's an interest in doing that. And definitely my co-chair is also interested, the chairperson of the committee I'm ranking, and that's the way we do it in the Congress, as you all know. I think there's a great interest in doing it. I don't know how much interest Secretary DeVos is going to show in higher education. I think her work has been mostly in private schools, particularly in her experience, but she is out there, and I think learning more about public education, which is something that we all hope that she takes the time and effort to do. I haven't seen as much, I haven't heard that much about what she would like to see in terms of higher education. The only real ideas we have are coming from the budget. And that's problematic, I think.
Good morning. Amanda Bergson-Shilcock from National Skills Coalition. Representative Davis, I was really happy to hear you mention adult education because so many folks in college right now are non-traditional learners, adults who are working learners going back to school while they're parenting. Can you talk a little bit about how Congress through HEA or Perkins can be supporting these non-traditional learners, which are now the new traditional learners?
I would hope that the reauthorization focuses a great deal on the non-traditional learner who's becoming a more traditional learner in many ways. And I think that, the lines between who attends school today are really different, and they're changing dramatically, certainly in terms of students who have families and have many, many responsibilities. We all would love to see students move through at least a 4-year period with some part-time work in most cases, as well as classes and an expectation to graduate. But the reality is that, as we say, life happens. And so for many, many students, there are so many reasons that they are delayed and they're not able to follow. I think the other thing that we all have to recognize is one of the problems that students has often is with remedial education, that were, in fact, they're really their own learning experiences have not been adequate for them to enter the universities and colleges. And so they lag behind, and then they get behind, and then it's really, really hard to catch up. So it's a continuum, and that's what we have to be aware of, preparing students earlier. And adult education, thank you for mentioning it, really does make a difference. And today has so many programs that, we often would think of adult education as perhaps for students who, hadn't been successful. Maybe they'd failed a class or two, or and really need to go back to school, back to high school. But in this case, it's an extension. And I think that, again, it's sort of this redefining what higher education is today that I hope is really a big part of how we move forward with this legislation.
Yeah, I noticed that it is really the subcommittee on higher education and workforce training. Exactly. It is a two-pronged.
And I would just say we have many examples around the country, great practices, and we need to learn from all of those.
Other questions from our audience?
Good morning, Congressman. Gina Luke with the American Veterinary Medical Association. Good to see you. Can you say a few words? I know you are personally committed to the full spectrum of higher education, and I was hoping that you could say a few words about graduate and professional education in the context of the reauthorization. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll go over, we're looking at a continuum, and so we even have, I think, hopes in today. There are many students who begin graduate school education while they're still at an undergraduate school so that they can have an opportunity to learn more about, is this where I want to go, to have a chance to look at some of those programs. I think the question of affordability for graduate school education is one that was broached yesterday, and whether or not there should be additional Pell Grants for graduate school education, additional work study. I think one of the other areas that I'd love to touch on for just a second here is one that more sort of generally would be considered national service, community service learning, whatever that is, that prepares young people at an early time to take a look, to be exposed to areas within their community that they someday might want to contribute to. And so I think it's important that we start young people early and perhaps even explore. I think in an ideal world, I'm not sure we're living in an ideal world right now, but in an ideal world, we could be thinking about what even students by middle school are doing as part of their education, which involves exposure, hands-on learning in many, many different ways. Veterinary science is one, of course. Young people can learn so much, can be prepared, and I actually think that if young people had some of these experiences even before college, again, then we're talking about a more traditional student, that they would have more ideas about where they wanted their education to go, and that might even shorten the time that they're in school. And again, it's the debt we're worried about, not the fact that they're in school. If students
It's on
who can
so many minds
afford
now.
to be perennial students, but most students cannot.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Appreciate it. As you can see, there's a lot of interest and concern about where things are going in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Davis, and thank you, Joey. And now a local take. States have been at the forefront trying to expand the possibilities for all students who want more than a high school education. Here to give us some perspective on what is happening in their states are two educators from very different parts of the country, but who seem to be on similar paths. Please welcome the Executive Director of Oregon's Higher Education Coordinating Commission, Ben Cannon, and Chief Policy Officer of Tennessee's Higher Education Commission, David Wright. They're here with my colleague, Ron Brownstein, Senior Editor at The Atlantic. Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. First of all, let me say I'm glad this is a seated panel, because it'd be very easy to feel overshadowed by our starting forwards here at the Education Summit. The Tennessee Promise and the Oregon Promise are both efforts to fill the gap between the cost of community college covered by federal aid and the remaining cost, essentially producing a tuition-free access for students who can fill out a FAFSA form. There are a lot of different places where states can put their chips on education reform, can put their dollars in the mix. Why did starting with Tennessee, because Oregon very explicitly followed Tennessee, why did you choose this as a place to invest your limited resources?
Well, I guess the soundbite we carry around in our heads in Tennessee is that you can never go wrong investing directly in students, right? And we also know that we have a workforce skills gap problem. We've established a goal that 55% of our workforce by 2025 will have a college degree or certificate of labor market.
Now? Where did you start?
We're at almost 40% now.
Okay.
But that number moves incrementally, very slowly, so it's an audacious goal. But still having that goal has really galvanized a lot of policy innovation. And so what we're trying to do is to make a quantum leap in terms of our educated and trained populace. And without that, it's an economic competitiveness issue, not only for our state, but for individuals and quality of life for them. A student who drops out of high school and enters the workforce is going to make less than $10,000 a year, and to us, that's just unacceptable.
And what did as you kind of looked, I'm going to say, you can think of it the whole continuum of education from preschool through four-year college institutions. What made you focus in right here? What made you see this as a critical transition point?
Well, our universities are great providers of opportunity in and of themselves, but we thought the greatest opportunity for change was at our technical college level, those institutions that award less than an associate's degree, and our community colleges. And we're not just trying to serve the traditional college-going population better. We're trying to bring new students into the higher post-secondary education tent, and we thought those were the two critical sectors, and so our programs.
How about in Oregon, Ben?
Yeah, similar. We're a state that also has ambitious goals for educational attainment. So bringing more students into college and then helping ensure that they succeed is consistent with our state policy agenda. Also, I think a real serious concern and interest in affordability. So as we, like other states, are dealing with rising tuitions and students who increasingly and their families feel priced out of higher education, focusing on the community college, creating a very low cost, at least tuition low cost path for students, in our case, students just coming directly out of high school, made a lot of sense.
Yeah, to that point, do each of you know to what extent your programs are bringing in first-generation students?
Yeah,
What's your experience with that?
Right, so we recently surveyed a fairly representative sample of our Oregon Promise recipients, and about a third, more than a third of them are first generation. And I'll point out, of those, an additional third said that they would not have gone to college without the Oregon Promise. We saw, overall, about a quarter of the Oregon Promise students answering that question saying, yeah, without this program, we wouldn't be in college right now.
Yeah, it's similar for Tennessee. We know that half of our Promise students receive a federal Pell Grant, and fully 1/3 of our first-time freshmen who enter on the Promise are receiving full Pell. That means they effectively have no expected family contribution, and there's a big overlap between that and first generation.
You know, in the decades after World War II, we gradually consolidated the belief that ultimately people needed 12 years of primary and secondary education to have a fighting chance in the economy, and therefore it was the states, the community's responsibility to provide that for them. Are we gradually extending that now? Do you feel it in Oregon and Tennessee? You're basically saying you need something beyond that. You basically need 14 years, and therefore it is our responsibility to make sure you have access to that?
I think that's right. I think for the lawmakers who supported the Oregon Promise, who have driven that movement in Oregon, the notion of a universal, free public education that extends beyond high school for an additional year or two is a central premise. So yes, we as a state generally have, I think, acknowledged and understood that a high school education is not enough, and this really represents an attempt to extend that entitlement to 14 years.
Yeah. And this is really not a value judgment that we're imposing on students. The data that I mentioned earlier of a student who doesn't graduate and enters right into the workforce, graduate from high school, is going to be making less than $10,000 a year. It really is an economic imperative for the individual as well as for our state. And
But very few states have accepted the response, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but very few states have accepted the responsibility of saying, yes, it's essential for the student, but therefore, you know, we have to provide it. We have to provide, in essence, 14, not 12 years of publicly supported access to education. Was that a hard sell from the other end of the equation in Tennessee?
Well, in our case, in Tennessee's case, we were very fortunate in that we had established a lottery and a lottery-funded scholarship program many years prior. And just over time, we had built up a reserve that enabled us to move a large portion of that and some other dollars into a corpus of funds that essentially now funds the Promise. So yes, the state is taking on that responsibility, but it wasn't a new ask for tax dollars. And so we've been very fortunate in that regard. So one of the first things I do when people say, well, what can we do to start this? I say, first of all, get a $450 million. Yeah. And so it's made it a relatively less painful decision for us.
And it's been a very relevant discussion, obviously, in Oregon, because unlike Tennessee, with the dedicated and pretty substantial source of revenue, you've had to go to the legislature and get an appropriation, I believe, on a year-to-year basis. How different a situation is that without this stable, dedicated source of funding?
It's hugely different. I can't impress upon you enough the magnitude of that difference. So we're back in front of the legislature now to advocate for funding to continue the program for next year. So while we're out in high schools, in classrooms, attempting to encourage students to apply for the program, we're also having to note for them that we don't know whether this program will exist or at what funding level it will exist for them in the fall. So they're in a tough spot, having to make a choice that without all the information that they need to make it.
In the budget debate, it certainly has been very explicit in Oregon, and I don't know how explicit in Tennessee, there is debate about the idea of the last dollar financing model, right? So maybe we should, before we get into the debate about the model, explain the model. In each state, you're not providing, essentially the state is filling in whatever's left after student aid, is that right?
That's correct.
Right. So what that means is that you will be providing more state dollars for higher income families than lower income families, right? Because lower income families would have more federal aid and other aid coming in. That has been a big point of debate in Oregon. Why does that approach? Why did you settle on that approach? And how do you deal with the complaint that, well, why is the state providing money to people who might be able to afford it on their own?
Well, it is. I mean, I think it's a legitimate conversation to have, and we're having that right now with the legislature. And I wouldn't be surprised to see at least efforts, and potentially successful, to trim the sales of the program for the most affluent students, or students who come from the most affluent families. I think there is something to be said for a program that's universal, right? That message cuts through in a way that a program with income restrictions, eligibility tests, I think has a harder time convincing students, including low-income students, who will qualify if they jump through those hoops, but convincing them that the program is for them. So the simplicity, the ease of a universal, free or nearly free program is compelling, and I think has a positive effect, obviously, for all who are able to take advantage of it, but including those low-income students who, frankly, may be financed primarily through Pell. That existed before. It will continue to exist. But the fact that it's free, universal, easily explained, does help sell the program and helps encourage them to apply.
Have you faced distributional questions on the same kind of issues in Tennessee?
Yes, I think sometimes as policy analysts and thinkers, we get in our own way sometimes, and we don't realize the power of that word free. We can sit here and debate where that cut point should be at which you should begin to defray the award and all, but in Tennessee, it really has changed the conversation around the Little League field among the parents and at the kitchen table. And I think what we would give up if we tried to go to a more nuanced approach, if you will, would not be worth it. Policy is inherently a blunt instrument, and you have to have stability and transparency. And for us, the word free provides all that.
Let's come back to that in 1 second. I think it's really important about the signal you're sending to high school students and what you're seeing in that. But there's also been, on the flip side of this, there has been a feeling and a debate for many years that community colleges suffer from income and racial kind of segregation in effect, and that they would benefit if you had more upper middle income, you had a more diverse student body that included more upper middle income students, and it was not seen only as an alternative for people who have less resources, changing the nature of who goes to community college and the mix.
And I don't know that Tennessee's even there yet. We're just trying to get more people involved. There are options within our higher education constellation of institutions, from world-class internationally renowned research universities down to a local technical college that serves a very small local community. And our ideal is to have a place for everyone who wants to attend.
Well, because I think I've seen data that in Tennessee you have seen at least some increases in the number of younger and full-time students on your community college campus. And I believe in Oregon as well, you see more applications from younger students. We talked to someone, a question I was asking before about the more adult learners, but you've actually seen more younger applicants as well. I'm wondering, has this required any changes by the community colleges themselves in terms of their expectations of who they're dealing with, how many people they're dealing with, how they deal with them?
Well, for us, capacity is not really an issue yet. I suppose in certain programs there might be waiting lists, but what it's done, it's been very positive. First of all, when you see a net increase of 5,000 students coming in as a result of this program, there has been a little bit of change in our enrollment mix, but what it's forced us to do by having this influx of new students, and some of whom are less prepared, it's forced us to get more real about the needs for remediating students, not only once they get to college, but even prior to, and making sure they have a path to go on via transfer afterwards. So I think it's been a really healthy, challenging but healthy debate in Tennessee.
So in Oregon, you are getting both some pushback and some competitive response from the four-year schools. Right, you have seen the data that we looked at. The share of in-state high school graduates who apply to the four-year public colleges has slightly declined since 2015, from 18.3% to 17.6%. Do the four-year schools feel as though they're being kind of squeezed out by the tuition-free promise in the two-year schools, giving them an unfair advantage?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization of the concerns that we hear from the four-year schools. Look, they've got a great product, a great opportunity to sell to Oregonians, and the competition that this represents from the community college sector, I think, is real. It's a great value, right? To go for zero tuition or near zero tuition compared to the rising tuition at the universities. So it puts them in a tough position. We try to emphasize that many of these students who begin at community colleges through the Oregon Promise intend to transfer and will transfer to four-year institutions in the state after a couple of years.
Portland State University has responded with a limited tuition-free offer of its own. How do you assess that development?
Yeah, I think it's a positive development. I think it's what we should see in response to efforts like the Oregon Promise. Portland State essentially using a similar model, saying last dollar, if you're Pell eligible, and theirs is restricted just to that population, will in essence cover the amount over and above Pell, which is actually not very much, right? At a in-state institution for resident students, the gap between Pell and tuition, even at the university, isn't that great. So for a relatively small investment on the university's part, they're able to make that same free claim that the community colleges are able to make through the Oregon Promise.
Ben talked about the transfer possibility, but of course, before you transfer, you got to finish. You got to complete at the two-year school. And nationwide, that has been one of the biggest challenges for community colleges. Your states are no exception. The Room to Grow report on higher education in Tennessee reported 3 out of 4 community college students in Tennessee do not complete a degree. In fact, there is not a single community college in Tennessee that graduates more than 50% of its first-time freshman students within a 6-year period. What are the biggest obstacles to completion?
Well, in many cases, you're dealing with students that are facing all sorts of challenges, economically, socially, family history, those kinds of things. So you're not dealing with a population that is sort of locked and loaded to finish. So we have to recognize that. And we do in the way we fund our institutions, we provide additional incentives to institutions to accept and complete those students. We essentially fund them twice the rate of a student who's not of low income or academically at risk. So we try to put those incentives in place, but the community colleges themselves, I think we've seen positive gains in terms of their responses. There are a lot more wraparound services for students, from summer remediation programs, summer early orientation programs. So it's a challenge. And change is incremental, but I know that we wouldn't be making the progress we are making had we not done this.
I've been in community colleges around the country, in Chicago, where they had a 7% completion rate. Now they've doubled it to 14. Still not great, but obviously progress. And people said, like, completion was not really part of the mindset historically. It was not seen as an important marker of success. What is your sense of why completion has been so tough for so many community colleges?
Well, a lot of the reasons David suggested. It is a population that isn't wired for success necessarily in terms of their level of preparation or the kinds of issues that they're facing in other parts of their life. And it's also the case that these are institutions that were not historically wired around that ideal. I think there's been a sea change in community colleges, at least in Oregon, and their emphasis on completion, their sort of training and retraining of faculty and advisors and other support staff to emphasize and support completion, I think has been remarkable. With our Oregon Promise students, we're seeing, at least initial data, and we're just in our first year, but we're seeing very high rates of term over term retention. Some of those students, to be clear, will transfer to a 4-year university before they have quote unquote completed, right? And we will consider that a success, right? Particularly if and when they go on to complete their 4-year degree. So, the measurement challenges are also real, right? It's not necessarily about the certificate or the degree.
David mentioned incentives for the institutions to improve completion. Is there anything built into the Promise programs themselves to try to incent the students? For example, do you require a certain amount of course hours per semester or even full-time attendances on the theory that you have a better chance of getting them through if they actually do it in an expeditious manner?
Yeah, in Oregon, so we require at least half-time attendance, and you have to stay continuously enrolled, at least except for the summer term. So there is an expectation that you're making progress, you're making satisfactory academic progress, so keeping your grades up. So yeah, the program is organized around the notion that you will complete a certificate or degree or transfer to a 4-year institution.
And you require, what, full-time?
Full-time, continuous enrollment. The award is good for up to 5 semesters, so there is a window. And one thing that might be underappreciated outside the state is the fact that students do 8 hours of community service every semester. And why is that? Well, it's a way, community college student engagement in particular at community colleges is an issue. And it's sort of our belief that students need to give we should expect that they give something back for the award they're getting, and students report positively about that.
I mentioned the Chicago experience, which may have been the bottom in terms of completion, and now they have improved, still very low, but significant gains. And one thing that they found was important in their gains was that less choice equaled more success. They made it more like high school, where where basically there was a pathway, and they were much more proactive in kind of channeling students in a particular direction rather than having them treated as an a la carte, kind of do a little of this, do a little of that. I'm just wondering, what have you seen in yours? Have you had any curriculum reform in your community colleges as part of this effort to, again, encourage more completion?
Sure. In Tennessee, we've established, I guess I should stress that the Tennessee Promise is one of several things we're doing to sort of try to pull everything in the same direction. And so we've established what we call Tennessee Transfer Pathways. These are degree maps that leave nothing to the imagination in terms of what's required and when for a student to complete the associate's or to go on and complete the bachelor's degree of their choice. So yes, we are trying to take a lot of the guesswork. Thinking back to my own freshman year advising experience where we sat down with the fall schedule and one of the coaches at the institution said, yeah, what looks good? We're trying to make sure that students realize that there's an end in sight and they know exactly how to get there.
Bring in the audience in a minute for questions, but Ben, same question.
Very similar in Oregon. Our colleges are deeply engaged in the work around guided pathways where students from the outset have a much clearer sense of their paths towards transfer, completion, or the job. Their choices are better organized for them. It's not about taking away their choices, but helping explain really the consequences and helping sort of narrow the bands in order to support completion.
You know, you each talked about the importance of the transfer possibility to the four-year school. And the one question I wonder, as somebody's having fun. One question I wonder is, it's a two-way process, right? Because, I mean, getting the four-year schools on board with accepting the course requirements of the two-year schools in many states has been an issue, right? And made it tough to establish a clear pathway. What's it been like establishing acceptance at the four-year schools about what the course requirements are at the two-year schools?
In Tennessee, it's been all ships so towing in the same direction.
Really?
We have now a common gen ed framework. It's not course per course, but essentially, if students follow these transfer pathways, there is no guesswork. They will be admitted as upper division students. There's nothing to do over. Compare that to when I arrived in Tennessee 10 years ago. Students were actively being counseled, get out of the community college as soon as you can so you don't lose credits. And that's been so helpful. So our universities realize that now with the Promise, to a very large extent, their own success is predicated on their ability to shepherd those students on through the last 2 years of the program.
Well, we're working on it. I wish I could be as positive about where we are as a state. We do have challenges for transfer students. The universities have different requirements. Efforts over the past in Oregon to sort of stabilize and make common those general education and lower division requirements have frayed to some extent, and I think we need to re-engage and are attempting to do that. Our universities and our colleges, particularly their faculty who set those requirements and establish those learning outcomes in the effort to smooth the transition process for students.
I know in California where I live, they've put a lot of effort into this, but they're still in a situation where almost all of the a disproportionate number of the transfers come from a very small number of community colleges that they've been able to kind of, build acceptance of at the higher level. And outside of that, it's still very hard for students. But you feel like it's broader. It's like this isn't limited to a few kind of flagship two-year institutions that the four-year system is comfortable with.
No, really, it's been all in for everyone.
Let's bring in the audience if we can.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Joe Fisher, CEO of First Generation College Bound in Prince George's County, Maryland. My question is. You've pointed on this, especially as it relates to college affordability. The challenges of first generation, as you mentioned, is the barriers they face as far as at home and transporting back to school. My concern is how committed are you, and you mentioned this already, those students being able to transfer is very, very important to be in a supportive environment compared to commuting back and forth. How committed are you into conducting data to show the success of the students transferring? I think that's very important, and I think it helps the community colleges in terms of how valuable that is.
Two things on this. One thing that I would like to use your question as an opportunity just to mention is that it's not mainly even about the check in Tennessee. So all the supports that we've mentioned, and the fact that one thing I have not mentioned yet is that each student is assigned a mentor. I serve as a mentor for 7 young men that go to a local high school. And so we're trying to model for them, that there's an adult, who's not even a part of your family, who cares and wants to see you succeed. But as far as the going on beyond the community college, we do have, in addition to the transfer pathways, we've seen fewer students having to borrow now, and so that makes it easy. We have found that our general ed core being in common, we find that the students who complete that prior to transfer are 25% more likely, everything else being held equal, to graduate than students that don't. So I think removing some of the just the wild things that can happen when you allow more choice, and then having that adult supportive person in your life, I think those two things have helped with first generation.
Follow up on that. You have a private university in Tennessee, Lipscomb University,
Yes.
that is now offering $10,000 in scholarship for each Tennessee Promise graduate who enrolls. Are you seeing anything? That's a kind of an interesting model. I mean, kind of not only saying you can transfer, but we're going to actively make it more affordable and easier for you to do so. Are you seeing? What do you think of that? Could that spread to other? Will the University of Tennessee do anything like that?
I think it can, and no doubt it will, with Lipscomb being the lead in that. There are also a few of our private institutions that offer associate's degrees, and Tennessee Promise students can attend that private college on the Promise as well. It's limited to the amount of community college tuition and fees, but we have roughly 2% of all of our Promise students do go to independent colleges. So they're very much, I shouldn't say very much, but they're a growing part of this whole, when I say inclusion, it includes the independent sector.
Over here.
Is Brogan Whetstone, and I'm a current master's student at American University. I'm also a first-generation BA and MA student in my entire family. And I know, because I also counsel students who are coming into my program as the GA, that this conversation seems to be focused a lot around tuition and fees. And I know for a lot of the students that I counsel, and myself in general, that wasn't the issue. Covering tuition and fees, Pell Grant covers that. And so I'm wondering what specifically the Tennessee and Oregon Promise are doing to cover cost of living expenses, the full amount and cost of going to higher education, especially when you're considering the difference between grants and loans and the different types of loans that are available. Because I find that that's something the students I counsel don't necessarily understand. And so I'm wondering how you're addressing that.
I'd just say, first of all, I think that's a terrific question, and it gets lost often in the conversation that affordability for many students is actually principally about the cost of living, not the tuition. And so just a great question, great point. You know, I think what the college promise attempts to do, I guess one of the assumptions it has is that many students, by going to a community college, will also reduce their living costs by living at home. Colleges tend to be more accessible, might be more closely located to home than the university. They'll borrow less, and then if they do end up transferring, yes, then they're facing that larger living cost, but they're less in debt or not in debt as a result of the first 2 years that they've had at home. But of course, that's not going to be true for all students. Living at home isn't an option, or living at home for free is not an option, even though they may be attending community college. So it's a really, really important point.
And I would just add to that having a Promise-like program does not absolve the state of having a full array of state aid programs, and of course, as you've already mentioned, the federal programs. So we do have a state merit program, a state need program, and it also requires states to continue to keep affordability as part of the conversation. We do keep an eye on tuition rates.
Let me close with a kind of a broader question. You know, if we were saying, as we were saying before, this reflects a increasing belief that 14 years, not 12 years, is what people need to have a fighting chance in the economy. If that's the case, should this kind of expanded access be left to develop on a state-by-state basis? Both President Obama and Hillary Clinton talked about a national program to provide, in effect, 2 years of tuition-free post-secondary education. Would it make sense, and do you feel in any ways you are the laboratories to determine whether this would make sense as a national initiative?
It really is time for a national conversation about this. And part of the reason why the Oregon Promise, like the Tennessee Promise, is so dependent on the federal dollar, right? And yet we're not having a sort of holistic conversation about how to take those federal resources, how to take those state resources and optimize them for community college access and success. We're doing it in a kind of patchwork way, but it hasn't been thoughtfully or holistically considered. And so, yes, ideally we would be doing this in a true partnership model in conversation with the federal government.
All for more federal and state partnership, but I would just sound the cautionary note that one of the really the elements that really makes the Promise program go is the local and state knowledge of the student, the nuance that we're able to put in our own spins, the community service, the mentorship. And if the scaffolding, if the infrastructure gets too big, you might lose some of that local innovation. So that needs to always be allowed for.
David Wright, Ben Kenny, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you. Join me in thanking this terrific panel. Thank you, guys. It's great.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben and David, and Ron as well. For our last conversation of the morning, we now have 3 experienced college administrators to talk about the big issues rocking campuses and about where higher education needs to go. Please welcome Eloy Oakley, Chancellor of California Community Colleges, the largest system of post-secondary education in the country. Sheila Baer is the president of Washington College, a private college on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Before stepping into that role, she was chair of the FDIC during the Bush and Obama administrations. And Peter McPherson was president of Michigan State for more than a decade. He's now president of the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. The APLU represents 235 public research universities, land grant institutions, and state university systems. And Ron Brownstein is back to lead our conversation.
You know, Peter, just the other day, thank you. President Trump tweeted that Abraham Lincoln is, undervalued as a president. He is, among other things, is the father, is he not, of the land grant system in 1862.
He
right?
was, in some ways, he was one of the more successful non-war presidents in the country's history. 1860s, a whole slew of legislation.
Exactly. So we want to touch on a lot of issues facing higher education. But certainly in this project, in this Next America project over the last few years, one of our central concerns have been issues of access and equity. And you all have different perspectives of that. When we look at the trends in access to higher education, we definitely have some positive trends. High school graduation rates are improving for African American and Hispanic students. And the share of and this is, I think, underappreciated, the share of African American and Hispanic high school graduates who continue directly on to post-education has now essentially converged with white students, all at around 2/3 or slightly more. And as more students of color enter institutions, African Americans and Hispanics and Asians are all increasing as a share of the total number of graduates. But the big but is that African American and Hispanic students who start post-secondary institution remain much less likely than whites to complete a degree. What's the disconnect? What is the biggest reason for the persistence of these completion gaps? Eloy?
Well, I mean, we still face several challenges, particularly for students of color. One is, yes, they're coming to our colleges in greater numbers, but the way we're organized for these students doesn't support their continued learning. They're exposed to standardized placement exams when they hit our colleges, which disproportionately affect them. The way we finance our students doesn't support full-time enrollment. So there's a number of issues that still plague our colleges that we need to wrestle with in order to ensure that this generation of students who are finally getting to our colleges can actually successfully complete a quality credential.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's definitely a mixed bag because they are going to college in greater numbers. That's wonderful, but they're attriting. They're not being retained. They're not graduating. They're amassing debt. And, that cohort is the biggest. Pew did research that shows lower income kids are much more likely to borrow and obviously much more likely to default. So that's the worst of both worlds. If you get the debt and you don't get the degree. So we're very focused on retention at Washington College. My inaugural year, we started something called George's Brigade. We did the research to see, okay, we want broader access to our college, we want more diversity, we want to bring first generation students in more, but we want to make sure they graduate. So what are the drivers of attrition? And the two biggest ones were financial need and a sense of social isolation, the research that we looked at. So we went out and raised money and decided to provide huge discounts, and so it's full need, room, board, tuition fees, everything's covered. We cap their borrowing. They can borrow for incidentals, but we cap that at $2,500 a year. Nobody's going to graduate with more than $10,000 of debt. We hired a special coordinator to provide support services, and we team them up with peer mentors, student mentors, faculty mentors, staff mentors. I had our first group this year out for a picnic at my house, and I said, are you being taken care of? Are you feeling supported? And they said, yeah. Every time I turn around, somebody's asking me, so maybe we're doing it a bit, but. It's a great group of kids. The other thing we did was we told them they could apply with friends if they wanted to, because we thought it's kind of a mini posse concept, because we thought, well, it's scary to come from inner city Baltimore to a remote Eastern Shore a small college in Chestertown, but maybe you come with a couple of friends who you went to high school with, it wouldn't be. So we said, we'll review as a group. You can be nominated as a group, we'll review as a group. So hopefully all those things will work. We'll see, but so far so good in terms of this first-year experience. Peter?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we can do, and we certainly need to do it. To me, an important figure is that about 8 to 10% of the lowest quintile income families have their sons and daughters graduate.
Yes.
That's in contrast to about 85% of the top income quintile in this country. We just have to do better. It's key to those individuals and to the future of our society. The mobility has to be better. Now, I think there are some things, and I note that many publics are working at this, and some of them are being really very successful. For example, remedial education. If you take a couple remedial education courses, when you enter a college, the chances of your graduating is very low. I think if you take as many as 3, it's almost negligible. So there's been a lot of work done by the Tennessee system, for example. Yes. But beyond that, the data is pretty clear. You can work it a little differently. In brief, you take one way to approach it is you take a remedial course and that feeds into the part of a 4-credit course, and instead of giving 5 credits, even though it's 5-credit time, you give 2 or 3 credits. And they're just phenomenal success. We know that more intrusive, if you will, advising, that's not a word we always use, but more engaged advising can have a lot of impact. You need to tell a student when they sign up for a course that doesn't count toward a degree, you really can't or shouldn't take that course. When students begin to get in trouble, you need to have a means of tracking the so-called IPASS system.
I think Georgia State University has been really at the forefront of that, using predictive analytics to try to, again, we talked about that in the previous panel about the community college level, steering students to a greater extent on a pathway.
It's very interesting. In the Vietnam era, we sort of backed away from telling students anything, which in Prentice's idea got very much out of favor. But in effect, we've begun to move back and saying we should tell students more about what they should do or can't do. And I think IPASS is a good example of that. I could go on, but I
went to a memorial service recently in Los Angeles for Tom Hayden, who would have appreciated that conclusion. Let me ask you this, because with a paradox here, and really the great research by Anthony Carnevale at the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce has been that the institutions that have the most resources, the most dollars to invest in student success, tend to admit the students who are most likely to succeed in the first place, right? So the Equality of Opportunity Project recently reported that the 5 Ivy League colleges include more students from the top 1% than from the bottom 60%. And the Carnevale research has shown that the increase in, the large increase in African-American Hispanic students, they've overwhelmingly been channeled toward the institutions with the least resources. So when you look at those trends, is the answer more to require the richest institutions, basically the best funded institutions, to admit more lower income first generation non-white students, or is it to provide more resources to the institutions that are actually serving them, or both?
Well, I'm obviously biased. In California, I think the resources should go to those public institutions that accept more of what is truly representative of California and the nation. California community colleges are 70% diverse. This is where most students of color, most low-income students, first-generation students access higher education in the California community colleges or in community colleges in general. I mean, we have the privilege of taking the top 100% of students. Yeah. That's a great, it's a great testament to the belief that everyone has the ability to succeed, and if just given the opportunity and the resources to succeed. So that's the struggle. How do we take a large public system in California? We serve more than 2.1 million students in the California community colleges. How do you organize yourself? How do you finance that opportunity. And I think that's what we're focused on right now is how do we bring resources to bear to get more students who have not participated well in higher education, not only to participate, but to complete a quality credential.
Sure, the land-grant colleges in the public sphere are certainly seen as as a portal for people who might not otherwise access education. How challenging is it for them to find a way to really make that bridge work?
Sometimes it is, and the more selective the school, the tougher it is. But I think generally we do a pretty good job and probably should be doing better. I love the idea that UCLA and most of the UC university system have more Pell students than all the Ivies combined, UCLA alone. It's a great way to think. I'm not for trying to tell Harvard what to do, that they're a private school, but I think, in fact, we need to give real credit to the schools. And, in fact, it costs more money to educate and get a degree for a Pell student than it would be others, because you need more advising, you need some of the tools we've talked about.
So just to repeat that, UCLA has more Pell Grant students than the Ivy League combined?
Yes.
Wow, that's quite a number.
Well, they're so big, and the
Yes.
Ivies are small.
Right. Still.
But it also is the fact that UCLA has 30+% of their students are Pell students. And that's true with Berkeley, it's true for, I think, the whole UC system. And, of course, for the state system in California, the numbers are even higher.
Yeah.
So I think to your
Community
question.
college is even higher than that.
To your question, I think they should be doing both. They should be doing much more to expand access. I mean, they have these multi-billion-dollar endowments. It kind of drives me crazy. Some of them even don't do a full 5% draw every year. And then they charge tuition, or they have these very low percentages of students. They can provide a free education to them, but it's not a huge number. So I think they should be doing more of that. They should be doing helping other colleges. And I would say, apropos of your question to funders, as one who spends a lot of time raising money, because that's one of the things college leadership does these days. You know, I can't tell you how many foundations I've got into where we only want to give to the top schools, right? So, well, not everybody can get into those top schools. And by the way, we provide a really quality education too. But I think it's self-fulfilling in terms of, you know, you talk about consolidation in the corporate sector, but you're seeing it in the college sector too, with these massive accumulations of wealth and endowments.
You know, just to button up this area, you mentioned the community college system in California is 70% diverse. We're now at a point where a majority of the public school K-12 system in the United States are kids of color. And at some point after 2020, I think the estimates are around 2025, a majority of the high school graduates are going to be kids of color. It's an irreversible change. Is the higher education system, in your view, prepared? Does it have a sense of the magnitude of the change? And is it prepared to kind of create a system that will allow that broader, more diverse entering student body to succeed?
Well, I think there's a couple of answers to that question. I think, you know, in general, certainly the publics recognize this tidal wave, recognize the challenge that's before us. And I think they are enthusiastic about meeting this challenge. And there's a lot of great innovation happening in our colleges and universities. The challenge is that the system is not prepared for it. The way we finance our colleges, our universities, if you just think about what's happening today with the Pell system, we're talking about cutting the Pell system. We're not talking about expanding the Pell system at a point in time when you have more first generation, more low-income students trying to access higher education. So the system itself, I don't think, is recognizing the need, the economic need of the tidal wave that's coming. I think our institutions are recognizing it, and there's a lot of innovation. And so our challenge is to create systemic change that really supports these outcomes.
You know, Bill Fry of the Brookings Institution, also University of Michigan connection, who may be our favorite demographer at Next America, he's projected that because as kids of color become a larger share of the entering freshman class, that if their completion rates do not improve, that sometime after 2020, the total share of adults in the country with college degrees will start declining, possibly for the first time ever, if not maybe in the Depression. There's very little precedent for the idea that the share of our workforce with a college degree will start going back down,
We can't have that happen.
Right.
We've got to increase the graduation rates. I mean, it's a major effort of most of the publics that I talk to, and I talk to virtually all of them. and needs to be even a greater effort.
Who do you feel has their arms around it best? Where do you look to and say, okay, this is a model that works?
You mentioned Georgia State. I think Arizona State. I think Central Florida. I think there's a number of schools, not a large number, but several that this juncture are doing an extraordinary good job. And I think there are a number more. We've just been beating on this, actually, a number more, 25, 30 more that you could see could in the years ahead, maybe they need some help and encouragement and support, but could become phenomenal success stories. And everybody's got to do a better job. And I think I've been at APLU for 10 years, and I was at Michigan State for 11 plus before that. I see in the last 5 years an interest and the excitement about doing a better job with graduation rates, particularly for low-income students, which is a lot of minorities, than I saw 5 years ago. I haven't quite seen the figures, and we track the figures carefully, retention and graduation rates. But I'm hopeful, though it's going to take pressure, and there's some things we got to do. We got to get year-round Pell, for example. We've got to, I think we ought to hold schools more accountable. We've got some schools, and it's not just the for-profits, it's some others that have terrible graduation and job rates. And they shouldn't, in this age of scarcity, terrible performers can't eat up money that other places could use.
Let's talk federal policy for a few minutes. And Sheila, let me start with you because you have spent a lot of time in this city. Hillary Clinton had a very ambitious agenda when it came to higher education, including tuition-free 2- and 4-year education, a revamp of student loan programs, a moratorium on student debt payments. By contrast, Donald Trump said very little about higher education in any direction, and Education Secretary DeVos also said very little about it at her confirmation hearing. It is more kind of known with the K-12 reform. What do you expect from the Trump administration and Congress on higher ed over the next few years, and what, if anything, do you want to see them do?
Well, I'll only speak to the higher ed level, but I do hope, he talked about, during the campaign, he talked about income share, to shift from debt to an income share type of situation, so that we scrap this idea of debt completely. It's broken, it's hurting kids. Make a contract with the student to say pay some percentage of their income over a long period of time. The Australians have done it for years. It automatically adjusts to, so if you're going to teach math in inner city high school and making $40,000 a year, you're going to have an affordable payment. If you go work for a tech firm and make $200,000 a year, you're going to have an affordable payment. Everybody's got downside protection. It's good for in the macro economy because if you get into a cycle, people lose their jobs, they lose their hours. The payment automatically corrects as opposed to debt, which is very inflexible. You get these massive defaults we're seeing now. So I think he talked about that. Jeb Bush, I thought, actually had a very interesting plan. And Mitch Daniels at Purdue has been pioneering it. We're looking at doing something at our own college, just in terms of the college, financing it through something like that, through philanthropy, which also gets to the accountability issue, because if a college is itself financing through income share, it has its own economic self-interest to make sure that student graduates, gets a job, and provides some return that can replenish the pool for future
Before
students.
I bring in Eloy and Peter, let me follow up, because you wrote to President Trump after the election,
I did,
urging him to focus on the debt.
And an editorial in the New York Times about it too, yes.
And any response?
Well, I had a few positive discussions with the transition team, and it's kind of been left there. So I'm hoping, and I still hope that they will engage in that topic again in October in Ohio. He gave a speech along those lines, and it has the virtue of dramatically simplifying these programs too. It's just the FAFSA is so complex that the different repayment plans are so mind-boggling. Just have one simple program, one simple ISA program, and one simple grant program, a Pell, and build it out. I agree, because for low-income kids, you want to do a grant model, or at least to pay for a good share of it. But I think through simplification, that in and of itself deters low-income kids to going to college, just because of the complexity of the process.
One more question to you before bringing in the two gentlemen. You've compared the student debt crisis with the mortgage crisis, and you speak to that with unusual experience, having been up to your eyeballs in the mortgage crisis. What is the comparison there, and what, if anything, does that imply for federal policy?
Well, I know I'm not always popular when I say that, but I do think that this freely available student debt has led to tuition inflation. It's been too easy to raise tuition because it was too easy for kids to borrow. He had the same thing in the mortgage crisis. It was too easy to borrow money to buy a house, and speculate on houses, and you were driving up home prices. You really weren't increasing access to home ownership, and the jury's out about how much more we're really increasing access to college with all of this debt. We're certainly getting a lot of kids in trouble over their head. And it's a drag on the economy, too. I mean, what really drove the recession in 2008 and 2009 was a pullback in consumer spending because of all this unaffordable mortgage debt. You're seeing the same dynamic. It's less pronounced with student debt. Young people, we're a consumer-driven economy. Young people tend to spend a greater percentage of their disposable income. But guess what? Their disposable income is being reduced dramatically by these outsized student loan payments.
Eli, what do you want to see from federal policy? Or what do you expect to see? What do you want to see for the next couple of years?
Well, I think certainly if there's a recognition of what we've seen post-election, that a lot of people feel disconnected to this new economy. And certainly this is true in California. There is a growing divide between those with education and those without. That has a direct impact on wealth, on ability to really thrive in this new economy. So what we'd like to see is a focus on community colleges who serve the greatest majority of working age adults that either want some sort of credential or are now unemployed or underemployed and need a credential to fully participate in the economy. So we'd like to see a recognition that the community colleges are a place to invest, to get people to the jobs that the president wants to create. We can talk about job creation all day, but unless we have a workforce with skills to enter those jobs, then there's no point. So that's what we'd like to see, and a recognition of how we're going to finance that. Certainly year-round Pell, investing in Pell for students that come to our community colleges. We want them to get out more quickly. We want them to take as many units as possible. So in order to make that happen, we need to have the financing available for them to do that.
Let me stick with that, because we just heard from Oregon and Tennessee, which now have statewide programs of tuition-free community college, each of which, both of them said, grounded on the belief that now 14 years is what people need to succeed, not 12. We had President Obama propose that as a nationwide program, Hillary Clinton as well. What do you think of that idea? Is, in fact, 14 years what people now need? And if so, should the states, should the federal government, should anyone guarantee it to them?
Well, I certainly believe that high school diploma is no longer the default to get into the workforce. We have to reorganize ourselves around a different set of credentials in order to and finance those credentials in order to allow people to get into the workforce. So I agree. It's well beyond the 12 years of high school now. So in California, we have a unique situation. We are a low tuition state. We have kept tuition down. California Community College is still the lowest tuition in the country. So the cost of tuition isn't the biggest barrier. It's the cost of attendance. So for us, making the promise, we already provide about 65% of our students don't pay tuition in the California community colleges already. So we're already making the biggest investment in free community college. We just don't call it that. Our issue is trying to figure out how we're going to package students in a way that allows them to go to school full time and not have to work and go to school in order to take a full-time load so that they can get into the workforce as quickly as possible. So that's the promise that we're working on. How can we package a student in a way that allows them to finish their credential as quickly as possible?
Before I bring in Peter, just to follow up on that, before your current position, you were in Long Beach, and you worked on a comprehensive effort to move more students, particularly those from lower income, into past high school with the Long Beach Promise. And that involved a lot of coordination between the K-12 system, the community colleges, and the four-year colleges. Talk a little bit about what you did and whether you see it relevant on a bigger scale.
Well, first, we certainly see it relevant on a bigger scale because the focus is on the student, not the institutions. If we focus on the student, then we begin to blur the lines between the systems and help those students track their way from early childhood education all the way through a bachelor's degree and beyond. That should be the focus. So all we did in Long Beach was, take a look at what the student needs and try to make sure that we can keep that asset in the community, give that individual the education they need in order to become an economic asset for the city of Long Beach And so we want to do that on a bigger scale throughout California.
Well, what was the critical variable in increasing the share of kids who were able to go on and succeed? Was it financial aid? Was it mentoring? What was the biggest barrier, and what did you have to do to overcome it?
The biggest barrier is cultural change, is getting into the homes of these students and helping the parents and the students believe that higher education is for them and the importance of higher education to their family and to their future. So once we accomplish that, and we do that through various means, working with them from early as fourth grade, and then making the financing piece as easy as possible, but also providing the support they need and the educational preparation. So we can't do that without a strong K-12 system, public K-12 system.
Peter, appreciate your patience here. What do you most want to see from federal policy in the next couple of years?
Well, I've got a whole long list, of course. If Margaret Spellings were here, she would say we need to get the unit record. We need to have a way to track graduation rates by individual institutions. We put together something called SAM that does a lot better than the federal government iPads. But we need very desperately the employment and income information a few years out after graduation. There's no way that the big institutions can know where those people are. And you need that by college and program. The federal government should have that and the states to hold us accountable. That's one thing. I agree that we need quite a lot of simplification of all these programs. These repayment and forgiveness programs are a maze, and I'm not sure they're doing it in the right way anyway. I'll tell you something that astonishes me is that you can draw a full-time loan when you're a part-time student. Think about that.
That's crazy.
I mean, this is crazy.
You know, the House Better Way document, both of you were kind of referring to streamlining. The Paul Ryan blueprint they put out last summer talked about streamlining federal aid programs into one grant, one loan, and one work study. Does that sound like it's on the right direction, or does that worry you about what that might actually mean in practice?
Well, the reason we've got this complexity is in part because we were adjusting to various circumstances. The work study programs have some real value. But I'm not, it's like doing the tax code, not quite as bad.
Yeah.
But I think that you can do more than what we have.
Now, the other end of the spectrum is we heard from Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and now from Andrew Cuomo in New York, picking up that baton, 4-year tuition-free public college or university for students of families at, I think, $125K or below. That's putting a lot of money down. Does tuition-free public university make sense in your mind?
Well, I think you'd have to do it right, and frankly, I'm not counting on it tomorrow morning anyway. I mean, I think that those are good political statements, and I'm not saying people aren't getting it done and where they'll do it, but I think those that are running institutions need to say, I need to work it next year, and I've got to contain the tuition, I've got to cut costs, I've got to reorganize, and I've got to drive my numbers for retention and graduation. I mean, those topics are more discussed in forums like today than they are on individual campuses.
But if you have a state like New York moving in that direction...
Well, will they?
Will they?
Will they? I mean, we'll see what the governor can do.
Do you think...
I'm not close enough to it. I haven't asked Nancy's
not whether they
input.
will. Do you think for public universities, would they see that primarily as a positive for your members? Or
Well, sure,
would they worry about it?
we would think that somehow they are getting more resources. But I think that we need to be held accountable for how we spend what money we get, and we live in a world today that's really tight. So,
what would that mean for private?
Yeah, well, I think it's, you're right, it's a good soundbite. I think obviously it would skew choice heavily towards the public sector. There's a lot of accountability with a private school. I mean, we're constantly under pressure. We are expensive. The way we provide education is expensive. Very small classes, regular, tenured or tenure track faculty members. a lot of hands-on learning, a lot of tutoring help and that type of thing. So it's not cheap, and we try to provide scholarship assistance, but because of that, we have a lot of pressure to show our value. And I do worry that if you just make it completely free, that lack of accountability could get even worse. And also, I think, another thing I worry about is that our public high schools are not doing very well. We've never really fixed that. And to what extent are we now trying to make college the high school? So instead, we're not really enhancing and expanding educational capabilities at some institutions. We're just trying to fix what they're not doing in high school anymore. And so I do worry that I love the idea of free community college in certain ways, but that some of the advocacy for that is just the high schools are not functioning well. Let's make community college free and see if we can fix it there.
You have all been drawn into issues beyond the immediate orbit of higher education under this new administration. Eloy, you and other heads of the California higher education wrote a letter to President Trump about the DACA students. On behalf of DACA students currently pursuing their dream of higher education in the United States, we urge you to continue this important program. This has to be especially relevant to your world. Latino students are the largest single ethnic group in the system. What has been the impact of the administration's words and deeds on immigration on your campuses to this point?
In a word, fear. Fear of what's going to happen. I mean, we're doing the best we can in California. We're fortunate we have a governor and leadership of the legislature that has made clear that we're going to defend the values of California. And the values of California include honoring those who are in our state and giving them an opportunity for education, because we see them as economic assets. We've already been through this argument when we had Prop 209 and Prop 187. We don't want to go back to those days. But as much as we can reassure students that it's safe for them to come on campus, we see the fear that's being created by the administration. So we think that's counterproductive. We'd like to see that end, and we'd like to see some predictability and an opportunity for students to come on campus and focus on what they're there to do, get their education.
Likewise, Peter, a couple weeks ago, you released a statement in response to the revised travel ban, and it read, "Our nation's universities thrive in part due to their ability to connect throughout the world. This new executive order undermines that ability." Why did you feel compelled to weigh in on the travel?
Well, our universities are very concerned about this. I think, in fact, international students are key to the things we do. They're key to our society. It's pertinent that last year 6 Nobel Prize winners were all foreign-born. And we all feel that virtually everybody in higher education that this is important to do carefully.
There's evidence that applications from foreign students is declining, right? Correct?
There is nationwide. We have not seen that, but yes, I mean our students we had a student from India who came in and said he was taking all of his stuff home for spring break because he didn't think he could get back in. It had to do with India, but it was just the aura of fear and a sense of unwelcomeness. So we also issued a very positive statement about welcoming all students, all nationalities, all religions, but it's hard.
More broadly, I mean, we've had university presidents before who were important public figures in various ways. I think back to Robert Maynard Hutchins or Clark Kerr in the 1960s. But I'm wondering, in this kind of increasingly turbulent political environment where you have all of these issues beyond those directly about Pell Grants or Perkins loans affecting you, do students, faculty, donors have an expectation that the people leading higher education institutions will be more engaged in some of the public choices, or is there reluctance to see them?
It's a great question. Within a period of time I've been involved, Father Hesburgh was such a
Father
great
Hesburgh,
figure.
Right?
And we haven't had these public figures out of university presidencies nearly as often as you did. Hutchinson was 50 years ago. Right. Kerr was
50 years ago.
Yeah. Hutchinson was even earlier, actually.
Right.
But so many things are happening that touch upon us beyond just making our places work. That maybe we'll get more involved. It's hard. It's hard because we're so busy.
Yeah.
We got so many things. It's also hard because we're in the middle of a media cycle that makes it difficult to do what we are supposed to do and do this public thing. But it's it's always appealing because there isn't any of us that don't have some views.
And is there expectations though? I mean, are the students in your, do they expect the leadership now to advocate?
Yes, I think there is an expectation that we will advocate for our values and that we'll be very public about our values. I think no one expects our college presidents, university presidents to be partisan, but certainly to lead on the issues of value and engagement and citizenship and what that all means. Because I think our democracy relies on our public universities, private universities, colleges, to really foster that civic engagement. And now is the time when we need to get into that work, because now is the time that it's become so important.
Shirley, you've written defending the idea of the liberal arts education when one of candidate Trump's advisors questioned whether students pursuing it, esoteric, I think was the word,
that's right.
esoteric should receive federal aid. What do you think is the role of the university leadership at this point?
Well, I think it's tricky for me because I was in Washington for a long time, and I used to ask a lot of questions about other Dodd-Frank and things like that. So that's easier. I think I celebrate the ability of students and faculty to engage and speak up. I think when the institution takes a position, it should be something that affects the institution. And clearly on the immigration issue, it impacted the institution. And so I do think it's appropriate then to articulate our views and defend our institution. But I think once you start going beyond that, then you start losing a little bit of credibility. So again, I think faculty, students, and we're actually a very diverse political community as well at Washington College. I encourage them to speak out, but in terms of an institutional voice, I think we should stick to the things that actually impact us.
It's a great issue, isn't it?
It is interesting. Let's bring in, we have something all the way in the back, over here somewhere. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Leticia Bustillos. I'm with the Campaign for College Opportunity. There's no question that increased student diversity on campuses has changed higher education. What we're not seeing is that same change reflected in the ranks of faculty or in the ranks of system leadership. What can be done to start changing that to reflect more of the student population?
Good question.
Well, I mean, certainly our institutions have not kept pace with the changes, the demographic changes, some of the social changes. And part of that is, there's a whole system misalignment. I mean, I have the pleasure of also working with the University of California, and we see the challenges in graduate education, the challenges in the diversity of the graduate student body. And so, that's where our faculty are trained. And so if we're not keeping pace in our graduate programs, if we're not focusing on those challenges in our graduate programs, they're not going to be reflective in our faculty or our administrators. So we need to look at this entire cycle of how we affect the change that we need to see.
We've got we're pleased to have a grant from the NSF right now looking at diversity in faculty. It's a plain grant, but we've been doing some careful thinking of how you could intervene along this whole chain. It's a problem, and when you look at the figures, the percentage of the diversity in the faculty hasn't changed much over a long period of time. I'm pleased to see the NSF and others are really focusing on it, and we have to do better. It's interesting that, in fact, people have been talking about this as long as I've been involved in higher education, 20 plus years, and the figures haven't moved much.
We have a question over here, and then we have a question over there.
Yeah, hello, my name is Sergio Marrero. I am co-founder of Anyone's Learning Experience, and my question is about how are we creating successful pathways beyond the 2- and 4-year degree. So McKinsey report shows 45% of 4-year graduates are in jobs that don't require 4-year degrees. There are too many people with higher education degrees driving cars right now as a way to maintain their income. And there is a mismatch between what higher education provides and what the workforce needs. What are we doing? And myself, as a first time in my family to go to college, have seen much of my family struggle to gain access, but also struggle to advance in the workplace. So how are we creating more flexible options other than 2- and 4-year degrees?
I think it's a really good question, because I think one of the sad facts we all like to talk about, a lot of people do this to justify all the debt, is that there's a big premium in the workforce by having a college degree. But the sad fact is most of that has occurred because real wages for people that only have high school degrees have declined, not because the earnings power of people with college degrees has increased significantly. So you're absolutely right. It gets back to the value proposition, holding colleges accountable, not just for graduating, that's important, but making sure those degrees mean something. And we put a big emphasis on experiential learning. We put a lot of our own money into it. We have freshmen from the beginning build resumes. We pair them up with faculty for collaborative research. We will pay them, we'll provide a stipend for them to do an internship with a local business. I think those types of outside the classroom experiences that are related to their field of interest very much more strongly position them to enter the workforce. So we're an undergraduate school, so we have limitations in terms of other things a major university might be able to do, but I think it's something all schools need to be focused on. It's a really good question.
We do need that the Department of Education be able to gather this data on income and employment a few years out. That needs to be there so students can have that information. The question of employment and whether or not you did a degree, the reality is that today people with degrees have about 2.5% unemployment, what the economists call friction. Essentially no unemployment except for moving between jobs. And it strikes me that that there is a need for more degrees, particularly from those lower income family groupings. On the other hand, I do think that certificate and other work can be very important.
Let's hear one last question.
I'm Joe Reddix, and this is a personal observation. I've been in IT for about 50 years, and what I've noticed is that we're moving toward away from a highest educated to a workforce that is more cost-effective, or the lowest cost workforce. Education is going to be extremely important to both of those, the highest educated and then the cost of the labor force, and especially going globally. If this current administration is focusing on saving money and things like that, what would be the emphasis to have such a higher level of education, whether it's community college or traditional 4-year or whatever? My point is this: if we are segregating the workforce, and I see this in the lower income brackets especially. I came from an environment like Gary, Indiana, and I saw it where the education that was afforded at that level was not at the same level of a Princeton or a Harvard or whatever. Our workforce is a lot more collaborative and communicating now, so those boundaries, geographical boundaries, usually are starting to fade, where you have capabilities because of global communication and more collaboration to enhance your job perspective. The key is what we as the government and people who are the ones who are putting the government together doing to enhance our workforce, to make sure that both the lower economic levels and the higher economic levels have a more peer-to-peer based approach going forward.
Kind of the role of education in a more stratified economy, I guess, is the
Well,
core.
I mean, what we don't want is a situation where, those of us with the degrees are now saying that we don't need more people with the degrees, and, the rest of you just get a certificate.
Right.
But we have to create a situation where, particularly for the bulk of the public who now needs a post-secondary credential, to create credentials that allow them to continue to move forward in their lifetime, so that they're not stuck in one direction. So as the economy moves, what we know today from the research is our students are going to have to switch jobs 10, 12, 14 times in their career. We need to provide an environment for them to continue to gain those skills over time so that they can fully participate.
Let me add one final fact as kind of a final thought to that, Sheila and Peter, which is that, to me, the single statistic in all my years writing about education, higher education, that sticks with me the most is that today, if your parents were graduated from college, you are 5 times more likely to graduate yourself than if your parents were not. And we think of higher education as the great leveler in our society, the ability, anybody can go as far as their talents can take them. And in many ways, it acts more to kind of reproduce privilege at this point.
Maybe reinforcing the status quo.
So can the system be viewed? Can the system be viewed as a success if, in fact, it is so much more likely that people whose parents attended are themselves likely to attend?
Well, we got to change it. We got to change it. I mean, your sponsors here, Illumina, Gates, and others, and universities around this country. I mean, I would say that one of APLU's primary missions is changing this. We feel intensely. It's just unacceptable to have 10% of the lowest quintile families get degrees. I mean, it's just, and people that say more of those folks don't need to get degrees, well, that was the argument we had over the GI Bill in 1945 in this country.
You know, and if the land-grant college is actually succeeding in that, maybe President Trump will find that President Lincoln's historical reputation at last will get what it deserves. So, Sheila, you got a final thought?
Well, you know, we already started the conversation. You have to go out and actively recruit the students. You need to find the financial support for them. We are all in on this. I actually have 2 first-generation alums on my board. So, but you have to do it. And I also think, though, it's important in terms of the higher education choices first gens make. They're not automatically steered into vocational schools. That troubles me a lot. You know, those technical schools will probably be obsolete in a couple years. I'm not saying vocational schools have their place. I don't want to suggest that, but a liberal arts college will teach you how to think, adapt, you know, communicate, write, and those are things that are going to serve them well throughout the career, no matter what happens with technology or the economy.
Eloy, Sheila, Peter, you're giving us a lot to think about. Join me in thanking this panel. Lindsay, we have one more set of thoughts for you guys. Thank you so much.
You do a really nice job.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ron and everyone. And before we wrap, I want to invite Jamie Marasotis, who's the president and CEO of the Lumina Foundation, to offer a few final words. Jamie.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and a special thank you to Lindsay and Margaret and to our colleagues from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Dan and his team, for a really thought-provoking and I think very interesting conversation. You know, I have to say I've spent 30 years of my life talking about higher education at a crossroads. And this is probably the slowest developing train wreck ever in my experience. The fact is there's been a rising demand for talent in the United States, and you can see it. You saw it most clearly in what we saw in the data of what happened after the end of the recession, when 99% of the new jobs were filled by people with post-secondary credentials. You've seen it with the fact that prices have increased faster than the rate of inflation for my entire career, more than 3 decades. You've seen it with the fact that student loan debt has become burdensome for a growing number of students. I was writing about this in the 1980s, and you've seen the ongoing concerns about equity for students of color, immigrants, and others going back for an extended period of time. You know, I think we could spend a lot of time talking about the challenges that confront us. I, for one, am very concerned about the environment, and Dan did a great job of talking about this in his comments, the environment that we're facing today. But I also think there's a truism that we should think about as we end our conversation today, which is that more Americans, more diverse Americans reflecting who we are, need more high-quality post-secondary learning than ever before. And I think it's extremely important for us to focus on the fact that there is some good news despite this environment of what we're facing in terms of these challenges. And you can see it in some of what we talked about today. The work that states like Tennessee and Oregon are doing is really exciting. In fact, 39 states have now set higher education attainment goals. We had less than 20 states just 4 years ago working on that issue of setting challenging, equity-focused attainment goals for their states. Affordability, innovation, and delivery equity, these are important issues for states. Even here at the federal level, again, despite the environment that I think we're facing, the fact that we've got, and it's probably worth remembering here how the process really works, Congress really controls the agenda of what happens in federal policy development. You've got a good working relationship between people like Senator Alexander and Senator Murray. You've got a conversation that in the last 6 weeks has returned to year-round Pell Grants more than it has in the last 6 years, in my experience in talking about these issues. And indeed, we're now talking about some of the issues about accountability that Peter McPherson mentioned, and some of the other issues that I think is really important. Institutions are providing leadership, the Georgia State examples, the kinds of things that we're seeing in competency-based learning and some other areas. My point here is simply this, that despite these challenges, there's also some hope here. a sense that there's opportunity for real change to happen, because that change must happen. We can disagree about the form in which we're going to get to the solutions that we need to get to, how we're going to pay for it, how to balance workforce needs with the broader needs of students, how the traditional higher education system should change to make that kind of learning more widely available, et cetera. But I think what we have to understand is that while all of those issues are really important, the need for high-quality post-secondary attainment, the need for more people to get through this system and contribute to our economic and social well-being is greater than it's ever been before. So I think it's vital that we stay positive, we stay focused, and we keep this conversation going, because frankly, our nation's future depends on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you to the Lumina Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for making our morning together possible. This is clearly an important issue that we will be watching closely in the months ahead. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to our speakers and to our journalists from The Atlantic, Joey Chen and Ron Brownstein. I have one last request before you head out the door. You should be receiving an email from me shortly to ask for your feedback. It's a very quick survey, and we'd love if you take a minute to share your thoughts. There also should be copies at your chairs there. You can share it with one of our colleagues as you exit. Thank you again so much for being with us this morning. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.